Hey folks, Hirsh Jain here, Director of Market Intelligence at Verdant Strategies. We have some exciting news. Virginia just became the 24th state to pass an adult use cannabis sales bill. Governor Abigail Spanberger is expected to sign the bill in early April, with sales starting in January 2027. And today I want to tell you why Virginia is the most exciting cannabis market to come online since New York legalized cannabis 5 years ago. But the story here is bigger than just Virginia, because what's happening in Virginia represents and accelerates something more profound. A shift in how cannabis is understood in America, particularly in Appalachia, one of the most culturally conservative regions in the country. Now, for years, the image of cannabis legalization has been tied to blue state culture, to coastal cities like Los Angeles, New York, or Seattle. And let's be honest, that framing hasn't helped advance federal reform, nor has it accelerated progress in more conservative states. We all remember how Governor Ron DeSantis used California as a key political talking point to defeat Florida's legalization effort in 2024. But if we're paying close enough attention, we can see that in conservative regions, like Appalachia, cannabis is being reframed. It's increasingly viewed not as a cultural statement, but as a public health tool, particularly in communities that have been devastated by the opioid crisis. And Virginia sits right at the center of that shift. Let's begin with the basics. Right now, Virginia does less than $200 million annually in legal cannabis sales through its medical program. There are fewer than 30 dispensaries open in the entire state. That's pretty modest for a state of 9 million people. But most analysts estimate that the state has the potential to become at least a $2 billion adult use market, probably more. That's more than a tenfold expansion. And that's unusual. Most states double or triple when they transition from medical to adult use. Virginia's growth profile is in a completely different category. Because the medical market is so small and underdeveloped in Virginia, when the state transitions to adult use, the growth will be substantial. Virginia also borders 4 prohibition states: North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Together, those 4 states represent 25 million people who currently lack access to legal adult use cannabis. That cross-border demand is likely to drive significant sales in Virginia's adult use market. And on top of that, Virginia will have a relatively low all-in tax rate of around 13 to 15%, depending on the locality. That's less than half of what you see in states like California. So for all these reasons, Virginia is poised to be the most compelling growth market in the country in 2027. At a time when the industry is starved for growth, Virginia could be exactly what it needs. But that's not the most interesting part of the story. Virginia is Appalachian, and that matters. When we think about Appalachia, we think about a region that has long struggled with poverty, economic dislocation, and serious public health challenges. John F. Kennedy brought national attention to Appalachian poverty during the 1960 presidential primary, particularly in West Virginia, where it became a defining issue in his campaign. The imagery and reporting from that trip helped elevate Appalachian poverty to a national political issue. Robert F. Kennedy followed later in the decade, visiting eastern Kentucky during his 1968 presidential run. Those visits produced some of the most iconic images of poverty in America at the time. Appalachia remains one of the poorest and most culturally conservative regions in the country. In many ways, it feels far removed from the coastal urban centers that have driven much of the cannabis conversation. And yet, Appalachia is opening up to legal cannabis. Virginia is the most recent example of this, but first, consider Ohio. When Issue 2 passed in Ohio in November 2023, legal cannabis didn't just win in urban counties. It passed in some counties that voted 70% or more Republican in presidential elections. And those counties had one thing in common. They were in Appalachian, eastern Ohio. That result disrupted the idea that cannabis legalization is a coastal culture war issue. In some of the most conservative parts of the state, voters embraced legalization. And Ohio's decision created ripple effects. Today, residents of deep red West Virginia and Kentucky regularly drive into Ohio to purchase legal cannabis. That cross-border activity is creating real economic and political pressure in neighboring states. West Virginia's medical cannabis program has expanded significantly in recent years. There are now almost 70 dispensaries operating across the state. More than 35,000 registered patients are enrolled, over 2% of the population, in one of the most culturally conservative states in the country. In Kentucky, Governor Andy Beshear has approached cannabis deliberately and strategically. He has framed it as a healthcare issue, not a partisan issue, as medicine, not ideology. And in a remarkable outcome, all 106 counties in Kentucky voted to approve medical cannabis, including counties that vote overwhelmingly Republican. Kentucky's program only launched in December, and in just a few months, more than 20,000 patients have already registered. And the state is now proposing to expand qualifying conditions to give even more patients access. Why is this happening? Because these communities have lived through the opioid crisis in a way that few others have. Appalachian Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, and parts of Virginia have been deeply affected. Entire towns have felt the consequences. So for many residents, cannabis isn't a cultural issue, it's a practical one. It represents a safer alternative, a tool that may help reduce dependence on opioids, a harm reduction strategy grounded in lived experience. That reframing is powerful. It helps explain why cannabis is gaining support in conservative regions, why counties that vote 70% Republican can also vote for legalization, and why the conversation in Appalachia feels fundamentally different from the one that played out in coastal states a decade ago. Virginia fits squarely into this regional dynamic. The counties in Southwest Virginia look a lot like counties in Appalachian Ohio. A similar history, similar economic challenges, similar public health realities, similar political patterns. If Ohio could pass adult use with strong support in deeply Republican Appalachian counties, it's unsurprising that Virginia was well positioned to follow. And that puts even more pressure on neighboring states, especially Kentucky and West Virginia. Kentucky will soon border 4 adult use states: Missouri, Illinois, Ohio, and Virginia. West Virginia will border 3 adult use states: Ohio, Maryland, and Virginia. That kind of geographic reality is hard to ignore. We've already seen what happens when one state moves. Ohio created ripple effects across the region. Virginia will accelerate that trend. It reinforces the idea that in Appalachia, cannabis is no longer a culture war issue. It's becoming a practical, widely accepted tool. And it pushes the region further along a path that Ohio helped set, towards broader acceptance and eventually broader legalization. But Virginia's importance does not stop with Appalachia. It also matters for the South. There are currently no adult use cannabis markets in the South. And with the possible exception of Florida, we may not see a southern state adopt adult use by the end of this decade. Virginia changes that. It shares a 300-mile border with North Carolina. It also borders Tennessee. And both North Carolina and Tennessee remain among the 9 states that still prohibit even medical cannabis. When Virginia begins adult use sales, residents of North Carolina and Tennessee will cross state lines, just as West Virginians and Kentuckians now cross into Ohio. That economic pressure will inevitably begin to shift the political conversation in North Carolina, Tennessee, and much of the rest of the South. Appalachia may be further along in its cannabis journey than the South, but Virginia represents a breaking point in the South, much like Ohio represented a breaking point in Appalachia in 2023. Once one state moves, the regional dynamic shifts. Lawmakers see revenue flowing across borders, voters see normalization, businesses see opportunity. And there's one more dimension that we should explore. When Virginia adopts adult use sales, Washington, D.C. will be surrounded by adult use states. Maryland already permits retail sales, and Virginia will join it. The nation's capital sits right in the middle. In 2014, D.C. voters overwhelmingly approved adult use legalization. Yet Congress has blocked the district from establishing a regulated retail market. The symbolism is hard to ignore. The federal government will soon be surrounded by legal adult use markets, while continuing to block implementation in its own capital. That contradiction underscores just how overdue federal reform has become. So, Virginia is not just about becoming a $2 billion market. It's not just about cross-border sales. Virginia is a turning point. It accelerates the reframing of cannabis in Appalachia, from a culture war issue to a public health tool. It opens the door in the South, and it sharpens the urgency of federal reform. When this bill is signed and the market comes online, it won't just create a major market of its own, it will accelerate a regional shift that extends across Appalachia, across the South, and all the way to Washington. That is why Virginia matters, and why what happens there will resonate far beyond its borders.